Carbonized scrolls pulled from the ash of Mount Vesuvius, described in a Smithsonian Magazine piece from late June, suggest that human beings possess an innate pull toward the good. These 2,000-year-old fragments argue that reason acts as a built-in compass, a natural guide for living well. But a different perspective appears in an essay for Aeon published just yesterday. There, Skye C Cleary examines Jean-Paul Sartre's conviction that there is no pre-existing blueprint for a life. Something interesting emerges in the tension between them. One view finds security in a universal natural order, while the other suggests that the heavy burden of freedom only begins when the compass is gone. Carbonized scrolls from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius usually turn to dust if they're even touched. Writing for Smithsonian Magazine last week, the writer looks at how new imaging is finally reading these fragments without unrolling them. Notice how the text mentions aristokrion. It's a detail that helps researchers map out an ancient Stoic argument, claiming that reason and a natural inclination toward goodness are the true foundations of human knowledge.
Scientists have deciphered the surviving fragments of a 2,000-year-old philosophical treatise frozen in time by Mount Vesuvius's eruption. The papyrus manuscript was part of a vast library preserved by volcanic ash. Now, the remaining passages, which examine ethics, knowledge, and human nature, are accessible for the first time since 79 CE. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, volcanic ash buried a vast library in the Roman town of Herculaneum. The hundreds of papyrus scrolls trapped inside were only rediscovered more than 1,500 years later, in the mid-18th century. But when scholars tried to unroll them, the carbonized manuscripts crumbled to dust. Every generation that followed faced the same dilemma. They could wait for technology to advance, abandoning hope of reading the ancient texts in their own lifetime, or they could try to open the scrolls themselves and risk destroying them. In recent years, researchers have settled on a third option. Using advanced imaging and artificial intelligence, they're deciphering the scrolls without needing to unroll them at all. The Vesuvius Challenge has accelerated the process by turning it into a public competition, complete with cash prizes. In 2023, a student won $40,000 for deciphering a single word, purple, from an unopened scroll. Later, contestants would identify 2,000 Greek characters from one scroll, $700,000, and the title of another, $60,000. Now, for the very first time, researchers have recovered all surviving text from a single scroll. The nearly 5-foot-long segment includes roughly 20 columns of ancient Greek philosophy, accessible for the first time in nearly 2,000 years.
The tech actually does look like magic, but it's not. Brent Seals, a computer scientist at the University of Kentucky, said at a press conference, "It's the remarkable means to a higher calling, the restoration of lost voices from the ancient world through the texts that they wrote in these fragile, enigmatic scrolls." Known as P. Herc 1667, this scroll discusses the nature of human knowledge, the ability to distinguish good from evil, and the merits of acting on reason rather than on impulse, ideas central to the philosophy of Stoicism. The manuscript also references Aristokrion, the nephew of the Stoic philosopher Chrysippus. The Library of Scrolls was found in the 1750s at a lavish villa that may have belonged to Julius Caesar's father-in-law. Inside were some 1,800 papyrus fragments, the only surviving collection of its kind from the Greco-Roman world. Based on snippets of recovered text, many of the scrolls appear to contain works by Philodemus, an Epicurean philosopher who lived in Herculaneum during the 1st century BCE. Epicureanism is a philosophy devoted to the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Stoics and Epicureans were rival schools. Federica Nicolardi, the lead papyrologist for the Vesuvius Challenge, tells National Geographic's Sam Keane. But debates and polemics between them were common. Although the team has deciphered all surviving portions of P. Herc 1667, more than half of its contents were lost to previous generations' failed attempts to read them. According to the team's preprint, 19th century researchers accidentally destroyed some of the scroll's outer layers. Renewed efforts in the 1960s and 80s caused more damage, revealing only small, illegible fragments of text.
The scroll's diameter, which started out at 1.9 inches, is now less than 0.8 inches. What survives today is only a small portion of the original scroll, Nicolardi said at the press conference. Although the title and upper portion of the text have been lost, we can now follow the author's argument across consecutive lines and columns. Quick facts. Attempts to unroll the Herculaneum scrolls in the 18th century. Camillo Paderni, a Roman artist, tried to read the scrolls by cutting them in half, copying out any visible text and scraping away layers. Antonio Piaggio, a Vatican priest, designed a technique involving weights on strings, which he used to open hundreds of scrolls, damaging or destroying them in the process. Seals has been working on virtually unwrapping the scrolls since the early 2000s. The process involved imaging the bundles of papyrus using technology similar to CT scanners, isolating thin layers and then stitching them together. In 2023, he partnered with 2 Silicon Valley investors and launched the Vesuvius Challenge. The project's leaders didn't expect to make so many breakthroughs in such a short time. In recent years, the frontier had belonged primarily to computer scientists, but now Seals hopes that they can start passing the torch to historians and papyrologists. I consider this to be a seminal moment because we're going to, from now on, be talking more about the texts than we're talking about the technology, he tells the Washington Post's Miriam Waldvogel. Based on the handwriting style, Nicolardi thinks that PH Arc 1667 dates to the 2nd or 3rd century BCE, which would make it one of the oldest scrolls in the library. The title and author have been lost to history, but experts suspect it wasn't written by Philodemus.
Perhaps, they theorize, Chrysippus was the author. Chrysippus was a foundational figure in Stoicism, but modern scholars only know of his writings from references in other works. To have access to a source text rather than quotes and summaries, which can be modified or interpreted by other writers, is very important, Thomas Coward, a classicist at the University of Bristol in England who isn't part of the Vesuvius Challenge, tells New Scientist's Haley Bennett. P. Herc 1667's surviving passages discourage an excess in the impulse, warning readers not to allow passion to triumph over reason, and advocate for phronesis, or practical wisdom. The text also explores the limits of knowledge. We will inquire into something, but we will not grasp it, if in some way we depart from ourselves and from our own nature. By our own nature, the author appears to, refers to human rationality and our innate inclination toward goodness, echoing Stoic philosophy, perhaps suggesting the use of reason and listening to one's inner drive are leading and crucial principles for seeking knowledge and virtue, Claudio Vergara, another papyrologist on the Vesuvius Challenge team, says in a statement. The team revealed several other new discoveries, including the identification of a title in P. Herc 139, Philodemus, On Gods, Book 8. Historians had previously known about On Gods, but they hadn't been aware that it contained more than one book. The researchers also announced that they deciphered more than 70 columns from P. Herc 172, which contains part of Philodemus's On Vices. The Vesuvius Challenge is now offering a $1 million prize to the first person or team to decipher another scroll in full by this time next year. As Nat Friedman, one of the founders of the project, said at the press conference, contestants are required to share their work so researchers can use their techniques to push the project forward. We've developed a systematic and a repeatable approach, Seals told the audience. Now, it's only a matter of time until we read all of the scrolls.
The first piece leaves the listener with a sense of relief, the idea that a natural inclination toward goodness is baked into the human mind. The writer suggests that virtue isn't something people have to invent from scratch, but something discovered through reason, acting as a reliable anchor that survived even the ash of Vesuvius. But moving from those ancient fragments to the crowded Paris lecture hall described by Skye C Cleary, that anchor vanishes. Where the Stoic treatise points to an innate blueprint for how to live, Jean-Paul Sartre argues that the most defining characteristic of being human is the total absence of one. The interesting thing is how these two perspectives treat the weight of a choice. For the Stoics, acting on reason is a way to align with a larger rational order, a source of stability. For Sartre, the fact that there's no pre-existing order to align with is exactly what creates the anguish he describes. Read alongside the ancient scrolls, Sartre's insistence that existence precedes essence starts to look less like a rejection of morality and more like a radical expansion of responsibility. If there's no natural map for distinguishing good from evil, then every choice becomes a heavy, solitary act of creation.
On 29 October 1945, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre emerged alone from the Paris metro. He was about to deliver a lecture titled L'existentialisme est un humanisme. Existentialism is a humanism. No one had any idea it was going to become one of the most famous lectures of the 20th century. As Sartre walked towards the venue, he saw a huge crowd of people gathered outside. He wondered if communists were protesting him and whether he should go home. He pushed ahead, really only because he'd made a professional commitment. While the crowd parted for celebrities, no one knew what Sartre looked like. He didn't tell anyone who he was, and as he slowly nudged his way towards the front, he was jostled about by brutal scrimmages for seats. The room was overheated and overcrowded. 15 people collapsed. An hour late, Sartre climbed to the stage to defend existential philosophy against his critics and argue that existentialism is a humanism. He had no notes, his hands remained in his pockets, but he was well prepared. He said what he came to say and then left. The hosts of Sartre's lecture, Jacques Calmy and Marc Bigbeater, had a modest budget. They bought simple ads in newspapers. Their wives posted flyers in Latin Quarter bookstores. Calmy worried, with a title like that, Existentialism. Just 2 months earlier, Sartre had publicly stated, "My philosophy is a philosophy of existence. I don't even know what existentialism is." Still, Simone de Beauvoir writes in her autobiography, "In the end, we took the epithet that everyone used for us, existentialism, and used it for our own purposes." Along with recent accusations that Sartre's novel Nausea, 1938, was anti-humanist, they hoped the title might at least be a paradoxical provocation. The morning after the lecture, Sartre met with Bigbeater at Sartre's unofficial office, the Café de Flore. Bigbeater apologized for the chaos and explained that between advertising, space rental, and the damage to Club, including 30 broken chairs and a destroyed box office, meaning that they were unable to sell tickets, they were having trouble coming up with the payment they'd promised Sartre. Sartre had read the morning papers over coffee and croissants and interrupted. "As for my fee, forget it. Besides, it looks like we were a success." One headline read, "Too many attend Sartre lecture. Heat, fainting spells, police, Lawrence of Arabia, an existentialist." The papers reported elbow fights, non-existential angst, and a no-exit situation, where the mob feared dying of suffocation. Critics accused Sartre of being too scholarly, but he was charismatic. His cool, his courage, his grit, and the force of his presence were striking. By the autumn of 1945, the atrocities of the Second World War had been exposed. The gas chambers, the camps, the friend betrayals, and the avalanches of banal evils. Beauvoir, Sartre's lifelong partner, wrote that people had discovered history in its most terrible form. Sartre was popular because, according to Beauvoir, there existed, at least at first glance, a remarkable agreement between what he was offering the public and what the public wanted. In post-liberation Paris, people realized they needed to reconstruct both their buildings and their moral foundations. Sartre challenged the idea that the only viable response to the Second World War was nihilism. Sartre's lecture was so successful that the publisher wanted to release it for those who missed out. It went internationally viral. "And that bothered me," Sartre said in an interview almost 30 years later, while acknowledging the contradiction. "If I found what I said meaningful for 500 or 1,000 people, why wouldn't I have found it equally meaningful for all the people who wanted to buy it?" He said he was still working out the moral side of existentialism, and the ideas weren't as clear or finished as he would have liked. Plus, it tended to be read as a substitute for the harder work of Being and Nothingness, 1943, and reduced his thinking into pull quotes. Although the lecture was framed as a defense of existential philosophy, it was actually a lot more than that. Existentialism is a humanism was a sincere attempt to address where our values come from. Sartre was challenging, in a serious way, the idea that the only viable response to the Second World War was nihilism. He was trying to construct a morality that avoids the anything-goes mentality. According to Beauvoir, existentialism seemed to offer the solution they had dreamed of.
In fact, it did not. Although people were hungry for guidance, and Sartre set himself up as a guru telling people how they should live, paradoxically, he was about to tell them to guide themselves. The official purpose of the lecture was to promote literary and intellectual discussion. But Sartre worried that the media was distorting his ideas and fueling his notoriety. He was also battling communists who blamed him for young people's suspicion of them, Christians who took issue with his atheism, and those who thought existentialists were people who swear a lot. Sartre felt his public image escaping him, a relatable modern anguish of watching a version of yourself circulate in the world, distorted and out of reach. He wanted to take back control and be better understood. As Sartre notes in the post-lecture discussion, he didn't want merely to impose his philosophy on others in books, and felt an obligation to make it comprehensible to those who were discussing it on a political or moral plane. The lecture can get dismissed as Sartre regretted it, therefore let's ignore it. But the truth is that Sartre had mixed feelings about it. The passion with which Sartre communicated his ideas, especially to a live audience, especially after saying that existentialism is strictly intended for specialists and philosophers, and then presenting ideas that were both scholarly and accessible, and vastly more understandable than his notoriously unwieldy being and nothingness, made existentialism is a humanism powerfully resonant. While Sartre's lecture had a huge effect during post-war France, its influence has not been preserved. It should be. Let us begin by saying that what we mean by existentialism is a doctrine that makes human life possible and also affirms that every truth and every action imply an environment and a human subjectivity, Sartre tells the audience. He was pushing back against the idea that objectivity is the most important way of understanding human life. Truth and action can't be abstracted from actual people knowing and doing things. While there are atheist and religious existentialists, what's common to them is the idea that existence precedes essence, Sartre explains, or, if you prefer, that subjectivity must be our point of departure. This means that at first, humans are nothing. We are thrown into existence, we encounter ourselves, our subjectivity, and then define ourselves through willing. If existence precedes essence, then we're responsible for creating our essence. A knife is the other way around. Its essence precedes its existence, because a knife maker thinks about the knife's purpose and properties, essence, and then crafts it, brings it into existence. By contrast, man is, before all else, something that projects itself into a future and is conscious of doing so. Man is indeed a project that has a subjective existence, rather unlike that of a patch of moss, a spreading fungus, or a cauliflower. The fungus claim may no longer hold, but the others do, as far as we know. Conscious projection makes humans unique and also means that man is constantly in the making, Sartre says. If existence precedes essence, then we're responsible for creating our essence. Man is nothing other than what he makes of himself, Sartre explains, and this is the core of his existentialism. If existence precedes essence, then man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself, yet nonetheless free because once cast into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. We're also responsible for what we don't do. If I decide not to choose, that still constitutes a choice. Some humanisms place humanity on a pedestal or treat it as a fixed ideal. Existentialist humanism is different because it places the full responsibility of human existence on human shoulders. We are the legislators of our own lives, abandoned but capable of choosing. By constantly seeking a goal outside of himself in the form of liberation or of some special achievement, that man will realize himself as truly human. The next step is one of the most contentious parts of Sartre's lecture.
I bear the responsibility of a choice that, in committing myself, also commits humanity as a whole. His logic is that whatever you do, you're implying that the action is worthwhile and that others could and should do the same. Marry or don't marry, you're making a statement about the value of that institution and what you think is the best option for yourself and for everyone else, too. We always choose the good, and nothing can be good for any of us unless it is good for all. This realization is a major source of existential anguish. Sartre writes, "A man who commits himself and who realizes that he is not only the individual that he chooses to be, but also a legislator, choosing at the same time what humanity as a whole should be, cannot help but be aware of his own full and profound responsibility." And if you're thinking that many people don't seem particularly anguished, Sartre's response is that they are merely hiding their anguish or trying not to face it. Another source of anguish is our abandonment. None of us chose to be born, and yet here we are. Sartre was an atheist and found God's non-existence extremely disturbing, because that means there are no a priori values, no ready-made purpose, no external authority to tell us what to do. But if God does not exist, it's not true that anything goes, because each of us is responsible for our actions. We have no excuses. I very much regret it should be so, Sartre explains, but there has to be someone to invent values. That someone is each of us, which is why Sartre says, such abandonment entails anguish. Sartre's advice to the student was, you are free, so choose. In other words, invent. Even if God were to exist, it would make no difference, Sartre argues, because you still have to choose which God, interpret which commands, and decide how they apply to your situation.
What man needs is to rediscover himself and to comprehend that nothing can save him from himself, not even valid proof of the existence of God. Obviously, I do not mean that when I choose between a cream pastry and a chocolate eclair, I am choosing in anguish, Sartre quipped in the post-lecture discussion. But when the choice is whether to go to war or not, anguish is the right word. Sartre tells the story of a student who came to him for advice. He was torn between joining resistance fighters to avenge his brother's death in the war, or staying home to care for and comfort his mother. Ethical codes can't resolve the student's dilemma. Christianity says, love thy neighbor. But which neighbor? His mother or fellow soldiers? Through a Kantian lens, in every situation he'll be treating someone as a means and another as an end. There are no signs to read, because the student is responsible for deciding what counts as a sign. Man is responsible for his own passion, so there's no point trying to listen to what his emotions are telling him to guide him. He will know what he values only when he acts. Moreover, to choose one's advisor is only another way to commit oneself. Sartre's advice to the student was, you are free, so choose. In other words, invent. Moral choice is like constructing a work of art, Sartre says. We are in the same creative situation. If you're thinking that some choices are gratuitous, Sartre says that's ludicrous because our commitments define us, and we can't escape that. We don't call a Picasso gratuitous because his works became what they are through his painting them.
What art and morality have in common is creation and invention. Sartre highlights two fictional innovators, Maggie Tulliver, George Eliot's brilliant, ardent Victorian heroine in Mill on the Floss, 1860, who doesn't pursue the man she loves out of loyalty to her cousin, and what Sartre calls human solidarity, self-sacrifice, and La Sanseverina, Stendhal's Duchess in The Charterhouse of Parma, who tries mercilessly to get her beloved to leave what Sartre calls his silly goose of a fiancé. Sartre reflects, here we confront two diametrically opposed moralities, yet I maintain they are equivalent, inasmuch as the ultimate aim in both cases is freedom. One is selfless and one is ruthless, but both acted authentically because they both chose deliberately and passionately. Neither was a passive victim blaming circumstances for their situations. Contrary to his reputation for individualism, Sartre argues that subjectivity is not strictly individual because it is not only oneself that one discovers in the cogito, I think, therefore I am, but also the existence of others. A person becomes who they are through others, and according to Sartre, he cannot be anything, in the sense in which we say someone is spiritual or cruel or jealous, unless others acknowledge him as such. We discover ourselves through other people's perceptions and demands, so much so that we each attain ourselves in the presence of the other. This intersubjective relationship is, in Sartre's view, the foundation of what connects humans to one another. While Sartre denies human nature, he argues we share the same human condition. Historical situations vary, Sartre explains.
What never varies is the necessity for a man to be in the world, to work in it, to live out his life in it among others, and eventually to die in it. This human condition is what makes it possible to understand lives very different from our own. Also all too common to the human condition is bad faith, the attempt to deny freedom and responsibility. Sartre describes two archetypes of bad faith: cowards, Lash, and bastards, Salode, in the sense of morally filthy. The person who says, "I had no choice," is Sartre's coward. Bastards act as if the rules don't apply to them, as if their power were a fact of nature, or as if the world owes them their place in it. Bad faith is obviously a lie, because it is a dissimulation of man's full freedom of commitment. The good news is that people are free to change. When you accept despair, you can stop waiting for the world to cooperate and get on with life. The personal costs of bad faith are serious, but at scale, the political costs are devastating. Writing in the shadow of the Second World War, Sartre was all too aware of the stakes. Tomorrow, after my death, men may choose to impose fascism, while others may be cowardly or distraught enough to let them get away with it. Fascism will then become humanity's truth, and so much the worse for us. Sartre says, in reality, things will be what men have chosen them to be. Sartre's antidote to bad faith, at both the personal and political level, is despair. It means that we must limit ourselves to reckoning only with what depends upon our will, or on the set of probabilities that enable action. Despair is what's left when you stop lying to yourself about what you can control, and then act without optimism or illusions. When you accept despair, you can stop waiting for the world to cooperate and get on with life. Sartre says you have to commit anyway, because man's only hope resides in his actions, and the only thing that allows him to live is action. Man is nothing more than the sum of his actions, Sartre declares. Blaming circumstances or claiming you deserve better is, for Sartre, self-deception. According to Sartre, there is no love other than the deeds of love, no potential for love other than that which is manifested in loving. You make yourself through what you do, not what you might have done. In life, a man commits himself and draws his own portrait, outside of which there is nothing. Sartre's lecture is motivating, but not philosophically watertight. For example, the idea that you are the sum of your actions is controversial, because some people think we have traits that aren't always realized. You might be a musical genius, but if you've never had the opportunity to learn how to play music, are you a musician? Sartre would say no, but Aristotle's concept of potentiality suggests a person can have unrealized capacities, just as a seed is potentially a tree, even if it never actually becomes one. Or consider glass. Brittleness is a quality of the glass, even if no one breaks it. But Sartre seems to be saying that it's got the capacity to shatter only when it's actually shattered. Some, like Aristotle, suggest that we are more than the sum of all actions. Sartre extends the same logic to our emotions, with equally questionable results. We are free to choose our passions, and to deny this is bad faith, according to Sartre. But people with depression or trauma don't experience their condition as chosen.
For anyone whose freedom has been constrained, Sartre's confidence about choice can come across as tone-deaf. Sartre doesn't answer why what's best for me is also best for everyone else. An even larger problem at the heart of the lecture is the way Sartre responds to the challenge that if I follow this advice, then anything goes. What stops me from freely choosing to be, for example, an egomaniacal politician with a proclivity for dropping bombs in other countries? Sartre's response is that if I choose for myself, I choose as if the whole of humanity were going to take my lead and do the same, or at least watch me do it. To do that sincerely will, he claimed, involve considerations of what other people think of me and constrain me. Here, Sartre is smuggling in Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, act only as you'd be willing for everyone to act. Stepping from choosing what's best for me to my choice is a model for all of humanity has been criticized as sketchy. The argument is weak because Sartre doesn't answer why what's best for me is also best for everyone else. Running marathons is good for some people, but that's no reason to think everyone should run them. Also, Sartre rejects the idea of a common human nature, but claiming nothing can be good for any of us unless it is good for all makes sense only if we share some common standard of what better means, which requires some understanding of what's better for all humans and implies a shared human nature. Moreover, Sartre never answers, why should I care if everyone did the same as me? You could say, I choose to be an egomaniac. Sure, it happens to be pretty evil by other people's standards, but I'm creating my own values, and that's just what I choose.
I'm being authentic. If you respond to Sartre's checks and balances style question, what would happen if everyone did what I am doing? By saying, but everyone does not act that way, then in Sartre's view, you'd be struggling with a bad conscience. Still, the egomaniac might say, yes, everyone should pursue their own desires. Let them. I don't care. Sartre talks as if somehow consistency would demand me to respect other people's freedom, but that's not automatically built into the concept of freedom. Hitler seems to have believed he was choosing passionately, deliberately, for the good of both himself and humanity, and thought it'd be good if everyone did as he did. Maggie Tulliver and Lassane Severina have polar opposite moralities, but Sartre says they're the same because they both aim at freedom. Sartre's test for a good choice is that it be authentic, deliberate, owned, not in bad faith. But the authentic egomaniac and the authentic saint both pass. Sartre never completed a work on ethics, apart from notes published posthumously. In The Ethics of Ambiguity, 1947, Beauvoir starts from a different premise. Freedom is always situated. A person born into poverty, raised under oppression, or denied education faces a structurally different existential situation than the one Sartre's lecture assumes. The choices available are narrower, the costs of choosing against the grain are higher, and the anguish of freedom can be taken over entirely by the anguish of survival. Willing your own freedom commits you to fighting for the conditions that make other people's freedom possible. While Sartre acknowledged situation, his version of it is thinner than the concrete social structures on which Beauvoir insists.
For Beauvoir, the obligation to others' freedom doesn't need to be smuggled in, because it follows from taking seriously the fact that freedom is always lived in conditions shaped by others. Freedom without attention to its conditions is more wishful thinking than philosophy. Sartre knew his philosophy sounded bleak, but he insists, no doctrine is more optimistic, since it declares that man's destiny lies within himself. We create ourselves by projecting ourselves toward goals beyond ourselves. A person is never finished. Recognizing that gives humans dignity. We didn't choose to be here, in this world or at this time, but we have to choose our way of living in it. The afterlife of Existencism is a Humanism is as a psychological self-help book under the guise of philosophy. One of the central themes is about discovering yourself as the architect of your own life. It works because it encourages people to seize life by the throat, to make decisions for themselves, and not to feel constrained by social categorizations or what other people think they ought to do. Sartre gives people philosophical license to remake themselves in defiance of the world. That might sound pretentious, but it's also empowering. The lecture is psychological in that it highlights patterns of blaming others and outsourcing decisions. It shows that you can't shirk responsibility, even if it feels like you can. One of Sartre's most important messages is that we're responsible for every choice we make, as well as every choice we don't make. And our actions mean something beyond ourselves, because our choices shape society. Every one of us is leading by example, even if in only a small way.
Sartre's lecture was polemical, globally resonant, and it's worth revisiting because it remains the most accessible gateway into some of the hardest questions about freedom, moral responsibility, and what it means to be human. What Sartre leaves us with is that we didn't choose to be here, in this world or at this time, but we have to choose our way of living in it. Nothing can save us from ourselves, which is bleak only if you confuse salvation with agency. Projecting and losing yourself is how you find out who you are. Experiencing anguish of choice is a good thing. Ask yourself, what if everyone did as I am doing? Where am I reaching for comfort when I should be sitting with anguish? And what does it mean to live without excuses? As Sartre once said, the only way to learn is to question.
Stoic fragments suggest that virtue is a seed already planted within, waiting for reason to water it. Sartre counters this by stripping away the soil entirely, leaving nothing but the raw act of choosing. What's left is the friction between finding a direction and the burden of inventing one. That silence, where a guide used to be, is where the work begins. If the universe doesn't provide the map, what is the first thing a person should look for to find their way?